So I'm Madi, an installation artist. Here we go. So I've been an installation artist for 15 or more years, and I studied sculpture at art school, but did a lot of film and photography as well, and then decided that I really wanted to combine the two. So it was sort of, for me, a lot about combining the 2D imagery and the 3D sculpture, sort of trying to find ways to do that. And within this sort of discovery was this idea of perception. So the perception really came up, in trying to marry these two things together. I really wanted to know more about the brain and why is it that we see the things the way that we do. And this led to, obviously, an interest in neuroscience with perception. So I really wanted to then collaborate with some neuroscientists. So I contacted some neuroscientists at UCL, and they were luckily interested in doing a collaboration. So I sort of worked in their labs for a while in a sort of residency. We had some discussions and so on. And out of this came this collaborative project, The Point of Perception. And this, so what you can see here, it looks like a screen. It's actually 3D. It's a sort of a very large grid filled with sort of hundreds and hundreds of strings, and then and mirrors and projections as well. And the idea behind it was meant to be a space. It was obviously totally abstract, but it was meant to be on the sort of brink of formlessness. So hopefully we'll show a video afterwards, and you'll get the idea, because the projections are moving. So you never actually, when you see it in reality, you don't see it like this as a sort of a proper object. It's always moving, and it's very hard. It really confuses your depth perception. So a lot of people have to touch it in order to work out sort of what's the spaces and what's the actual object and so on. And the idea was that it was going to be a place where the mind can't rest, because it can't resolve what it's looking at, but it can almost resolve what it's looking at. So it sort of, keeps it on this brink. So that was that one. This is actually making the large version, because it was about 2 or 3 meters deep, and this large version was about 3 meters, I think, in width, and it took 4 of us to weave. And it took hours, in fact, days. I had this huge box created, and then 2 of us got inside and 2 were outside, and it took 4 of us to actually weave the whole thing over many days, and then the projections. And so what was interesting to me about this was, firstly, that idea of people having to touch it. So that's kind of, I think, first sparked my interest in touch. This idea that you could fool the eye couldn't understand what it was looking at, but you couldn't fool the hand. Once you'd touched it, then you kind of understood it to a certain extent. But the other thing that really interested me about it was that, although it was completely abstract, there was nothing narrative in there at all, people had a really sort of emotional reaction to it. So they were kind of excited or quite calming, felt kind of quite calm. And they sort of saw things in it, a bit like looking into a fire or something. So it really sort of ignited things in their brains and their imagination that weren't necessarily there. So this partly then, so it started to spark other interests. One of them was the multimodal, because of the touch. So it was this idea that that I couldn't just look at perception, that actually the senses are so interrelated that I had to look at other senses as well. And also attention. I sort of then got interested in attention, because if you're not attending to something, you literally can't see it, as Polly can explain. And this seemed really fascinating to me, that you could actually just not see something that was in front of your eyes because you weren't attending to it. So that's how I sort of got interested in these 2 aspects. And as it says, what was interesting to me is, as it says, that if in one stimuli will always be affected by another stimuli, as in you cannot separate them out. So I got in touch with Polly and found her work really, really interesting because she was working in this area of attention, and particularly with regard to hearing and touch, with sort of like tactile attention. And I didn't find very many people working in that field, and that was really what I was interested in, was tactile attention. So that was great. And so, yeah, so we sort of had lots of meetings and discussions, didn't we, and sort of did some other smaller projects and so on. And then in 2018, we did Digital Forest, and this was at Royal Holloway, and it was an 100 square foot gallery. And the idea was to sort of replicate the attentional aspects of a forest. So it didn't look like a forest. Again, it was reasonably abstract. And so the idea was not to make it look like a forest, but to sort of try and capture the essence somehow. And we were looking at some psychology experiments which had looked at forests and how they relax your attention. I think, as Polly might say, some of this data has now been questioned, but I think the ideas were interesting. That why do green spaces and forests relax your attention? And there was sort of many theories about the kind of the mystery of it, the level of complexity, the fractal geometry, even the sort of timing, the cadence of it, the sound, and so on. So I tried to kind of incorporate all those aspects into the forest. It had 3 different zones to it, really, but one of them was like this, sort of lots and lots and lots of tiny little pieces of projection fabric, which I then projected onto from 2 different projectors. So with sort of we did also actually carry out experiments in the gallery with this. And what I was interested in, particularly in terms of attention and installation art, is that, of course, installation art is inherently multimodal because you're always sort of looking at the different senses. But in a way, a lot of art is multimodal because you're always in the world when you're experiencing it. But often not all of the aspects are choreographed. So my interest really with working with Polly is to find out more about the sensors, how they work together, and therefore being able to choreograph the experience more tightly and therefore better. One of the things that did come out of the forest was that I really wanted to include this sort of tactile element in it. But that aspect to me wasn't quite as successful. I think the visual and oral sides to it were much more successful. Because although I'd been thinking about the tactility, obviously when you then put it into a space with thousands of people coming through, as we did, the tactile becomes very difficult. And so lots of people did touch it, and it actually got damaged and had to keep being repaired and so on. So I kind of was still very interested in the tactile, but wanted to focus on that more and make that sort of the main focus of a new piece of work. So the next piece of work, and this was only done last year, this was 2023, was called The Complexity of Touch. And so again, Polly and I worked together, and she'll explain more about the experiments, because we did some experiments in the lab beforehand, which were fascinating and very illuminating, and I used some of the results to inform the final exhibition. So again, it was shown actually in 2 places, one in Bermondsey in London and one in Twickenham. And the Twickenham one particularly was quite big, and so we were able to have sort of different zones. So one of the things, we had these ceramics suspended from ropes, and we had these symbols, and the symbols created the sound. The sound was actually done by Nye Parry, and he put all these symbols in with actuators in them. They're sort of like little speakers. So the sound actually comes from the symbols themselves. It's like a feedback loop from the symbols, and making the symbols into kind of resonant objects in the space. And it's a generative kind of, not exactly soundtrack, but a generative sound, so that it was sort of spatial and never repeated itself. So this is another shot of it. So I had sort of the things suspended, plus I still had a lot of visuals in it. I had a lot of visuals on the walls and on the sculptures. But everything could be touched. Everything was there to be touched. So that big ring there was actually a really big, soft sculpture. And obviously the ceramic ones were hard. And then there were projections on all the sculptures and the walls. And these rings here in the bottom, these were sort of like very large vessels on the floor. And inside those we had kind of natural materials, so again, things that you could touch and feel and so on. And kind of buried within those were more objects, sort of different objects, things that were a bit sort of, a little bit bone-like, a bit shell-like, a little bit like small animals. So the kinds of things you had to sort of sift through and find these sort of hidden things. And as you can see, the ring shape became a sort of motif in a way. So there was sort of lots of different rings for people to discover in different ways throughout. And this was some of the smaller objects that people could find. And I'm just, this was actually just some of the feedback, which, because Polly's going to talk about feedback for Digital Forest, but actually, again, we didn't try and do any experiments in the space for this, but we did capture a lot of feedback, and again, it was really fascinating looking at people's comments, and a lot of people, again, felt it very, very calming. A lot of people stayed in there for a long time, and really, really sort of, and sort of really soaked it up, which is great. And yes, and the last thing I was going to say, with these objects, obviously they were created as ceramics. They are fragile, so again, it sort of felt a little bit like a sort of a gift as well, giving these rather fragile objects to people that had taken me quite a while to make, and just hoping that they would treat them kindly, because obviously they could pick these up and touch them and drop them, which they did. But thankfully, most of them did survive. So I'm going to pass over to Polly, and then afterwards we might show a couple of videos so that you can see a little bit more about what I've been describing. Oh, no, you've got one. Yes.
Great, thank you. Actually, one of the things I pick up from that also was when I was in the space and just watching how people were interacting with the complexity of touch, there was often a reticence as well, because I think people are so unused to being given that permission to actually go and touch really beautiful artworks, which they were. So it was interesting to see how they had to sort of often go through a process of, tentatively starting, and then, apart from the children who just went straight in and really enjoyed it. So as both Sylvia and Madi have said, my background is in the science of attention and multisensory experience. But one of the things for me that's been so special about this collaboration working with Madi is that it really prompts me to think more creatively about immersion and about sensory experience, and that in itself is a really nice feedback, I think, because we work together, and that you've seen some examples of the kind of artwork that comes from that collaboration, but equally it influences my thinking on the science of perception and the way that I approach my work as well. So it's been a really special two-way kind of a collaboration, which has been really fun to work on, and I'm going to try and give some examples of that, first talking about Digital Forest and then coming to the complexity of touch. So as Madi touched on, with Digital Forest, one of the ideas that we were looking at was whether experiencing an environment like a forest or a natural environment could allow people to restore or replenish their cognitive capacity so that they would be more able to concentrate on tasks after they left that experience, which had been claimed for exposure to natural environments. And so that was one of the things that we wanted to test. So we did run some experiments. We did have people spend some time in the forest. I think we may have a participant here. Thank you. And then before and after, complete some cognitive tasks. That we got a trend in the direction of people improving, but it didn't come out as a significant effect when we did the analysis. But what we found really nicely coming out from the visitor comments, oops, I've gone too far. This was the 10 most frequent words. I counted up the 10 most frequent adjectives that people left in the comments. And going from left to right, so we have relaxing, then we had cool, then we had amazing or amazeballs, people, I counted them as the same. Then we have calming, where you see it, beautiful, interesting, nice, peaceful, scary, and dark. So I'm sorry that they're not all fully showing up. But what's interesting here is that one of the things that we were looking at was this idea that the forest might be restorative in some way. And so from that perspective, the idea that relaxing was coming up, calming and peaceful were all aspects of that kind of effect which you might then expect to lead to the replenishment of people's cognitive resource. And you'll see some quotes in a minute which, again, people were reporting to us that they did have a subjective experience of having felt that. But the other thing you can see dark on here, and with scary also being mentioned, I thought was really nice finding, and something that was a bit unpredicted, I guess, in terms of maybe what we were expecting to see. But as you said, not necessarily a negative thing, because it means there's something kind of challenging about this experience. It was very dark when people first walked in. And so I really like that. Of course, it's also thinking about a forest. Often a forest can be scary. If you think about fairy tales, often there is a level of threat that's going on around a forest and what might be lurking inside there, and the fact that you can't always see around the corner, which was very much the case for this installation as well. It had corners that you went around, you weren't quite sure what might be there. So I thought that was really nice, coming out in more of those qualitative comments. And this is one of the ways in which this collaboration has been so important to me, is that my training is very much in terms of the science, and that's why we started off with this very kind of abstract and reduced cognitive task. Actually, what I found is that, being freer in talking to people and understanding their experience, going broader in the way that we look at it, has been really helpful. And this is just some evidence that we get from the visitor comments that people were actually spontaneously telling us that they did leave feeling rejuvenated, restored, or that it had allowed them to clear their head. So that was some evidence that we were getting some of those effects. Yeah, that's going to come up, that is in the animation. Because these were some other quotes that came from the visitor book, again, that were, I think, really fascinating and, again, unexpected. And what I really like here, and thank you to Sammy Campbell, who was really helpful in going through the visitor book and picking these out, is that you've got these really interesting juxtapositions of maybe experiences that feel like they wouldn't naturally go together. So unnerving but calming, alien and soothing, and the most extreme, terrifying and relaxing. So again, I think that's just really interesting for me about the importance of first of all, being open to what people are going to tell you, because you're not going to predict how people will react to these things, but also kind of embracing that complexity about the way that people might react to these types of experiences, that there could be aspects to their response which perhaps almost seem contradictory, but that can be held by the same person, I think is really interesting. We've only just found this, so we were just talking about it earlier about how it might be something that's interesting to look into more in the future. So then turning to the complexity of touch, and one of the first, given that the title of the work invites a consideration of complexity, that was actually one of the first things that from the scientific side I really struggled with, because complexity none of the people who work on really mathematically defining complexity, there are many different ways of doing it, and there's quite a lot of disagreements about how to measure and quantify complexity in the first place, lots of different approaches. And talking about multisensory experience as we are, it was also really clear that mainly people were thinking about visual complexity when they were talking about complexity, and that the idea of auditory complexity and tactile complexity, which were both things that we wanted to look at, were far less studied. And then trying to come up with something that actually applies not just outside of the visual, but also across all of the senses that we wanted to look at, was quite tricky. And then you throw in the very interesting thing about tactile perception in this context, which is that people are in control of their own haptic exploration as well. They could feel 10 objects in 5 seconds, or they could spend, an hour very slowly exploring one of the objects. So actually, although many of the objects were designed, and it did work with to try and make a more complex object versus a less complex object, and we did a pilot test to check that our assumptions were working. The idea of finding something that applies across all the senses was quite a challenge, but interesting one. And in the end, we went with quite an informal, kind of more verbally based definition, which brings together quite a lot of the thinking, so that the complexity could be thought of as increasing with the more features that you have in a given space and time, so the more frequently these lines bob up and down, for example, the more diversity that you have in the feature, so all kinds of different types of stimulation, and then also the less predictable the stimulation, the more complex it seemed to be. So that seemed to be a working definition that could apply across the senses and also to the objects that Madi was making. And so we did run an experiment in our lab. We have a little soundproof booth, which you could see here. And Madi made some videos which were varying in visual complexity. We had tactile objects that were varying in tactile complexity. And we gave people a combination of the visual and the tactile, such that they could either be, both really, really complex, or they could, one could be more complex, one could be less complex. And the question, which feeds into a really hot topic in the science of multisensory perception, is the extent to which that combines across the senses. So if you have very, very complex visual and tactile input, let's say, do you then actually prefer to have a less complicated auditory soundtrack because you've reached your sort of limit of your processing? That was the basic question that we were looking at. And as I said, it's been studied a lot in the kind of science of perception and attention. But normally with very abstract, very, very simple stimuli. And also generally it's the visual demands that are manipulated, whereas here we were also interested in what's the impact in particular of changing the tactile demands. And so I can just give you a few snapshots. I won't go into loads of detail because we're not here for a long talk. But the first thing here is that we asked people to make judgments either on which auditory level would you choose in combination with this visuo-tactile experience. We asked them to set the level of complexity that they would like, both to make them feel calm, but also to make them feel interested. And the first thing we can see is to make them feel interested, they want more complexity than to make them feel calm. That's probably kind of quite predictable, but it was nice in a way to show us that what we're doing makes sense and seems to be in line with the predictions. And so there are just a couple of quotes there. That lower level of complexity made the person feel calm because they were feeling a curvy side and they felt that the music was complementing that. And then for the interest, they're saying whether the audio fits the shape, it's a complex shape and it makes you interested to explore. This was something really interesting that came out, which is a very interesting suggestion, which again would be, I think, something fascinating to look at in itself, is that sometimes this influence seemed to go in the other direction. So whichever level of complexity they chose, they were always exposed to all of the different levels of complexity. And what some people were reporting was that actually the level of complexity of the audio was affecting their tactile exploration behaviour. So the high complexity audio made me play with the object more. It was very energizing. So there's really interesting interaction, which was not something that I had predicted, of what you're hearing actually affecting the way that you want to move your body and the way that you want to engage with the tactile. And again, the rhythm of the high complexity audio was in sync with the movement of my fingers. The faster the music, the faster my fingers went. So I was really happy with some of those findings. Just really fascinated by that. And then in terms of the interactions between the senses, this is exciting because we did get really clearly significant results here. It was when people were making calm judgments. If they were feeling a very complex visual, tactile object and seeing very complex visuals at the same time, they were very clearly preferring to have a lower level of auditory complexity. Whereas if they were having a medium level of complexity in the visual and tactile, then they were choosing a higher level of audio complexity. And that's really nice because it replicates some of the findings that we have seen in the scientific literature, but using much richer types of stimuli and judgments that are a bit more like everyday life judgments. And some nice quotes here. So in terms of choosing when you've got both of the visual and the tactile of high complexity, this person said, I was focusing on what I was feeling and looking at. With the higher complexity sound, it was too overwhelming. So that's that idea of that you reach your point of your sensory capacity reaching a limit. And the fact that that might operate across the senses is really interesting for us. And then here, the person saying, when they've got the medium levels, they're choosing a medium level complexity. It's the right amount of sound, makes you feel good. I think neither person who did the sound liked that quote. That's it from me. Thank you. Were you going to show the videos now, maybe?
Yeah, sorry. So this the first one you'll see here will be Digital Forest. And this was a very dark installation. The only light was from projectors. There was about 15 projectors in the room, but that was, some of them were just mini ones with small amounts of light. So obviously it was very, very hard to photograph and to video. So this gives you an idea of what people were experiencing, but not really the full, what it was really like. And particularly one of the zones I called the rain area, because every so often it would start up and digital rain would fall and so on. That was particularly hard to capture. So at the beginning we've got sort of raindrops, and that's kind of stimulating the rain area, because I couldn't really capture it in documentation. Then there's just a couple of short excerpts of other installations actually that I haven't talked about. But one of them is point of perception.
Inside.
Mick Golden, Bernard Smith, Neil Bentley, Frank Ellis, Waiters, Andy Barker,
Tim Sunderland. Ashley
Paul
Clark.
Jackson, yeah.
Ashley
Clark,
Clark.
and Steve Markey.
So it just gives you a slightly better idea of the sound, really, although, again, it was very spatialised, actually, in the space, so it's slightly hard. And the other thing I forgot to mention about the sound was we did have a very big bass speaker, and the idea was to try and so people could feel the sound. You know, we actually had the vibrations that people could physically touch.
Thank you so much for this presentation, and I was wondering if we have any questions from the audience, or thoughts, insights. Barbara, yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, before pandemic, there used to be a multisensory festival in London, organized by different universities in London. And there were spaces throughout 5 days in summer where you could go and have all sorts of different experiences. It was absolutely amazing. I think it was so well attended. You could go and listen to classical music whilst smelling different smells. There were VR places of experiences as well. There was like amazing. I think there is still space. People would be really interested in, attending like events that, help people to have the multisensory experiences.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. That sounds absolutely fascinating. I'll certainly look into it. You know, there must be documentation of it, and whether there's still something similar that people could get involved with. Thank you for letting us know about it. But I think what you're saying about that demand for experiences that speak to senses other than the visual, I think is really true, and it's nice to have that as an example of it. Part of our thinking was also about sensory differences, and maybe, one of the people who advised us a little bit on the complexity of touch was an academic at Royal Holloway, Hannah Thompson, who has expertise in visual impairment and in general in she's got a project at the moment about making museums more multisensory, and so we were thinking about, making an experience that's, if you make it a bit more multisensory, it can draw people in who might not be, for one reason or another. It may just be personal preference, it may also be sensory difference, that it can hopefully speak to people in different ways and different people.
So I think there are already quite a few museums that work like this. So for example, in Warsaw, there's a museum of Friedrich Chopin. So the music is played, but also he's associated with smell of violets. So there's a smell of violets, and people can touch things as well. So it's really, really, I think that's definitely something very important to develop.
I also, just to say on that I've been doing some work recently with kind of new technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality as well, and thinking about expanding those, because at the moment they're still quite audio-visual in the way that most of us experience them, but the possibility that you could be looking at bringing other senses also into those types of experience would be a really exciting direction, I think, in order to create more of these experiences and bring them to wider audiences.
No, it's all right.
Sorry, were you going to add on to that? No. Okay. Yeah.
No, it's all right.
Hi, thank you so much for your really great presentations. I was going to maybe ask kind of a question around this binary or tension that's built up between, the kind of, I guess, lived experience of the biological or natural world, and then this act of translation or mediation into the digital. This kind of almost like simulation of the experience of something that we all have a very individual relationship to, which is our experience of nature or the natural world, and our sensorium that is dictated around that, and then yourself as an artist and yourself as an academic at that point of trying to not universalize exactly, but try and mediate or translate something that is a simulacra of that. How does that kind of work within your remit?
Yeah. Yes. Let's both answer. I mean, I know what you mean, particularly when we were creating the forest. In a way, it seemed odd because obviously there's lots of forests that people could go and visit. So there was definitely a point, and even particularly around Royal Holloway, there's lots of forests, and there was a point where I thought maybe I should just bring people in a forest, into a real forest. But so yes, I don't fully have an answer for that. It's just that I like to create things, and of course I am influenced by nature and by forests and things, so you want to take the experiences that you like and somehow create things with that and translate it. It is also because I am very interested in that sort of universalism, the fact that most people like, obviously we're all individuals and unique, but actually we all kind of like the same things to some extent, and I'm very interested in that. So it's in a way, I suppose it's an arena for me to look at how people really do behave in these environments, and to create something that's new, that that doesn't just replicate, and so particularly complexity was new, but it borrows from elements of all kinds of things. And it was just something that comes from that experience, but has translated into something different, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question, and I think you, if I remember correctly, Maddie, you did always say it wasn't supposed to be sort of a direct translation of a forest. I guess it was supposed to be, or it was obviously so many things to so many different people, and we had some comments of people going back and back and back, as did I. I would go and hang out there, and I was absolutely, genuinely really upset when it left Royal Holloway, because it became a space that a lot of people really enjoyed going to, and you would see different things in it and get different things from it every time. I think the way I understood it was that it was more about maybe exploring some of the types of sensation that you might get from being in a forest, but just exploring them in a context that was deliberately almost kind of abstract in terms of the way and that you know a lot of your work is, and that it was kind of inspired or informed by those experiences rather than seeking to be a direct translation of those experiences. But I had the same thing. I was really actually quite worried if we'd have found some enormous effect that people would have been like, we can chop down all the forests and just make digital ones. So I definitely think it was a completely different experience from being outside in a forest. But it shared some of the sensations somehow. But it's a really interesting question as to how. Just going to say, just a thought I've sort of had now, that because in a way with the complexity of touch, my idea was that would be like a composition, like a musical score, but for your hands. It was meant to be a sort of very beautiful thing, and in a way, it's a bit like writing a musical score. Why bother when there's birdsong? There's lots of beautiful sounds out there, but you still create your own thing. So I suppose in a way it's the same as that.
I was just curious, have you explored a bit more those difficult sensations of fear and being terrified in that space but excited, like what happened with that angle?
No, it's something, as I said, it was a kind of wonderful thing that came out of it. I think we did have a sense at the beginning, especially watching people again, going into the space. I think it was clear that people often found that challenging, and I think we ended up, asking the kind of invigilators there to maybe just, if they happened to be around, to maybe say, give yourself a bit of time, because the dark adaptation, that's another interesting psychological phenomenon, or biological phenomenon, but the dark adaptation that we can get is really strong. So when you walked in from a bright environment, it felt almost pitch black. But soon people would start to adapt to the dark, and then they would gain that confidence of exploring further in. I was just really fascinated to see that type of feedback coming out, and actually it's only recently that I did this counting, and to see that 2 of the top 10 words are about scary and darkness was really, really interesting. So I would love to explore that more. And I really like Madi's reaction to it, where, because we were talking about it just before this talk, where you said, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. I think that it's really interesting. Yeah, because, you know, there are lots of situations in which we sort of expose ourselves in an ultimately controlled environment, because everyone knows they're in a university gallery, so nothing really that bad can possibly happen, but we expose ourselves to kind of controlled threat. And, you know, think about horror movies or scary roller coasters, or these kinds of things. You know, it can be a pleasurable experience in itself when ultimately you do know that you're safe. So I think that's really interesting. I would love to explore it more, and also that way in which you could feel that but still also ultimately think that it was also calming or soothing or something. Do you have any comment?
Not really, just more to say that I would actually also like to explore that more. But
that's our next project.
Yeah, just that idea of deliberately creating a space that was both scary and calming.
Yeah,
would be. I'm not quite sure how we'd do that yet, but that's quite good. Yeah.
We're looking forward to seeing what's going to come out of that research, and thank you again